In 2020, a Danish newspaper ran a headline claiming that women are a net deficit to the economy.
And I was like, how do they get to this?
How do you even arrive at a conclusion like that? Well, maybe it's because our economy measures what's easy to count, things like people's salaries, and overlooks the time that we spend caring for one another.
Actually, within economic bureaucracy, there is politics. It's hidden away, but it's in there. And it's in the models, it's in the trade deals, it's in the GDP. In the most important economic documents, care work and leisure time and time with family and time for rest are seen as expenses, as non-value creating activity.
Why do we assume that GDP and an endlessly growth-oriented economy are the only model that we can believe in?
We've been taught that economics is like physics or chemistry, so there's no other way to do it. Both the climate crisis and what I would call the care crisis, which I think we are in now, are really pushing these questions to the fore of how should we define wealth in the next 50 years? What does it mean to be a rich country?
I'm Katie Lee, host of the podcast The Europeans. In this episode, we're speaking to the Danish-Swedish writer Emma Holten, author of the award-winning book Deficit, about how we measure value and what that means for the future that we're building. If we're measuring the wrong things, does that mean that we're building the wrong society? Emma, it's so nice to have you back on the show.
It's so wonderful to be here again.
So we last spoke to you what feels like a lifetime ago, back in 2020. And at the time you came on the show to talk about your work as a campaigner on online consent. How did we get from there to here?
Good ask my psychoanalyst. So I've done a lot of work and have since 2014 on digital sexual violence. So I was a victim of non-consensual image sharing way back in 2011 and did a lot of feminist work about victims' rights. And now I'm working on feminist economics and care work. And I think there certainly is a connection. And I think it is, how do we take care of one another? Who do we decide who is worthy of care, who is not? And why are we in a situation in our part of the world, Europe, where we have such endless wealth? We've been so successful at increasing GDP, making a lot of money, compared to the rest of the world. We are by far the richest part of the world in many ways. Yet we're also a continent with extreme levels of stress, depression, anxiety, loneliness, lack of connection, and those issues seem to be increasing. Yeah. And I think I was very interested in that paradox, like why are we not able to translate all this wealth into more well-being? And we haven't been, for the past 25 years, we haven't really seen any significant increases in well-being in Europe. And I think having been a person who has suffered a lot on this continent and felt a lot of loneliness and despair, I was interested in how that happens and what it means.
Well, I'd like to throw that rhetorical question right back at you. How did writing this book change your understanding of why care work is so badly paid?
I come from a feminist tradition. So I think that was kind of my initial way into this question. And I read a headline in a Danish newspaper in 2020 that said that women were a net deficit to the economy. And I was like, how do they get to this? This seems odd to me. Because, it presented value creation as very simple to calculate. Everyone knows who creates value and who doesn't. So I kind of pulled that red thread. And what I found going down that rabbit hole was that all through economic history and up until now, up until the models that we use today in finance ministries all over Europe, in the EU fiscal compact, in the most important economic documents, care work and leisure time and time with family and time for rest are seen as expenses, as non-value creating activity. So all of the things that I think are some of the most important for human flourishing are seen as something we actually should have less of. So the less leisure time we have, the richer the country looks. The more money we spend in H&M makes us rich, but the money we spend on a healthcare worker makes us poorer. And as soon as that kind of, and that took some years to kind of follow that thread, but as soon as I understood that, the jigsaw started falling into place, and I started understanding that there is a fundamental issue with how we talk about value and what is actually valuable in the economy and to people.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking for myself, I realized fairly recently that I really have spent most of my adult life unconsciously believing that paid work is somehow a more valuable thing to do with one's life than caring for others in the unpaid part of the economy, like being a full-time parent, for example. And I feel so ashamed about that. And I also feel really ashamed that it took becoming a parent to realize that, like, I couldn't see how important this work is for all of us and how freaking hard it is until I did it myself. And it really felt like I was emerging from a form of brainwashing, like the story that we have told ourselves for so long that care work it really isn't that valuable. It is incredibly deeply ingrained in our societies. So what do you think we could do to undo that idea?
Yeah, I think I had the same experience as you. Was when I started this book, I was 28 or something. It took me 7 years to write it, and I was very afraid of having children. I was scared of it, and I associated with unfreedom, with being less valuable in society, with being less important. And I really wanted to confront that very shameful feeling in myself. Why am I afraid of becoming a woman in a way? Why do I find mimicking men's lives to be more valuable than the lives that women have traditionally led? And I think a lot of people emerge from my book with a lot of understandable anger, but it is also a hopeful book, because what I show is that we've been taught that economics is like physics or chemistry. So there's no other way to do it. What you've grown up with, Katie, and what I've grown up thinking, that's just what value is. But what I show is that how we think about economics, how we think about value is affected by culture, by activism, by institutions. It is actually something that we can interact with and change. And I think for many of us, both the climate crisis and what I would call the care crisis, which I think we are in now, are really pushing these questions to the fore of how should we define wealth in the next 50 years? What does it mean to be a rich country? And I think it is possible to change, but it is a huge endeavor, because these things are inside systems that are difficult to penetrate, difficult to understand, and that look, and I think this is the most important thing, that look apolitical. And I think one of the most important points in my book is that sometimes when we do activism, both in feminism and in climate, we tend to, try to affect politicians or affect the public discourse. But what I show is that actually within economic bureaucracy, there is politics. It's hidden away, but it's in there. And it's in the models, it's in the trade deals, it's in the GDP. And we also need to be present in those spaces to really transform how we do politics and how we prioritize in politics.
I feel a bit embarrassed to ask this question as the only man in this conversation, but
Go
in the book,
right ahead.
In the book, you make the case that feminist economics doesn't only benefit women. Like, in what way does everyone benefit from feminist economics?
I think that is a really central question. You're smart to ask it, because I think for a long time, feminism and the type of feminism that has been pushed forward by the EU, by business, by politics, has been women living men's lives. So, and I think we all understand why, right? We wanted women to work also within feminism, to have their own money, to vote, to get educations, all these types of things. But when I look at men's lives today in Europe, I ask myself, how enviable are they really? We are seeing extreme unhappiness among men, frustration, anger, lack of meaning, lack of social relationship, worse health outcomes, more suicides, more violence. And I think it's a central point in my book that I'm not really sure what gender I feel the most sorry for. I feel sorry for both genders now, but in different ways, because women are getting poor from doing care, right? It's making them poor to work in the care sector. The salaries are low. It's undisrespected. It's difficult work that is not, does not have a high status. They're getting poor from becoming mothers. But if you look at men's lives, I think many women do not envy it, despite men being richer on a monetary level. And I think in many ways, I'm more curious about a world where men's lives look more like women's than the other way around. That we start seeing that actually the lives that women have traditionally led, being with family, engaging with local community, engaging with friends and family on a more, intentional level, is actually a life that is tremendously valuable and important. And right now, men are just so chained to the role of breadwinner, to the role of worker, and so much of their identity and value in society is connected to them being successful at work. And I think that is a hugely stressful and unhappy place to be in. And I think that right now we're doing men a disservice as well from not being able to care for themselves and others.
Yeah, I loved this thing you wrote about the fact that there's been a lot of focus on the right for women to go to work, but also the right to be able to stay at work and choose to be a caregiver and choose to experience like family love. That's also something that I wish for men as well, actually.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about your producer, his relationship with his kid under COVID, right? I think sometimes we have this idea that, men work because they don't care about their family. They prefer their career. I think this is a huge misunderstanding. I think for many men, their paid work is how they express care. So they will say, I'm working to make sure that there will be new football boots, that there will be maybe a summer trip in July. And thinking that men work so much because they don't care about their children, I think that is a huge misunderstanding of how men perceive their own lives. But right now, we've created a society where everyone must work as much as possible. And that is perceived as the desire of people and as the desire of the economy. But right now, we think of work as value creating, but work can also destroy value. By taking time away from family and rest, by using up natural resources that might be better used other places. And I think this idea of looking at work as not something that always creates value and leisure time as not something that always destroys value is kind of a central point in how I think we can criticize an economy and look at wealth differently.
You cite economists all the way through your book who are critical of the mainstream economic thinking that has influenced our society so much over the last couple of centuries, really. The idea that everything has to have a price, that unpaid care work somehow doesn't count. I am actually married to an economist, and he was really curious to know what you think the most useful thing working economists today can do to help people think differently about all of this. Like, would you like to see economists putting more emphasis on certain areas of study? Or is it more just about how they communicate the work that they're doing, which, in many cases, as you touch on in the book, is covering these kind of issues?
Really good question. I think there are a couple of things. So first of all, I say this with a lot of love and kindness, but some humility with regard to their own discipline, knowing their own limits. So, for example, if a politician asks you, should we spend €1 billion on hospitals, yes or no? You should say it as an economist, I'm very good at the cost of hospitals. But if you're asking me, how many doctors should we have? And how should we organize the work and where should it be? Maybe you should ask a health researcher who can supplement my knowledge. Because right now, we're using economists for every question, for education, for healthcare, for childcare, for climate. And I think like any discipline, it has limits. And what I show in my book is that up until extremely recently, and I would say still, care work is just not something that has garnered that much interest within the economy, within the economics profession. You don't get fancy professorships and lots of funding from studying, parental relationships with children. You get that from studying inflation and financial markets.
I mean, there are people studying this stuff, though, to some extent. But as you say,
sure.
It's relatively new.
It's relatively new, and they're trying to come up. And I think they are also struggling sometimes to be truly heard in the places where it matters, which are the big macroeconomic questions. How should we spend billions of euros? When you ask that question, you don't ask, the microeconomist who are doing these small types of research on family dynamics, for example. You'll ask someone who does macroeconomic modeling. So I think there's also right now a little bit of a fight within the economics profession about how it should look. And I think this has been going on since the financial crisis. That questions like, I think Piketty obviously has been one of the people raising this question, but more and more people are doing it, asking, are we spending our time on the right things? Are we really understanding what's going on? Or are we too focused on areas of the economy that maybe are not where we should be? So I think understanding the limits of your own profession and letting other professions supplement yours, other types of research supplement yours, we could get a much richer image for policymakers. Because what I'm seeing all over Europe is that policymakers are looking at an economic calculation, and that calculation does not necessarily take into account human flourishing, education, social relationships, and local community. So I think that would be the first thing. And I think the second thing would be question where your ideas come from. I think that's been something that has been revelatory to me, is that in a lot of economics education, you're not necessarily taught about historically the internal fights that have been in your discipline. They're taught these models as if, like I said, they're physics or chemistry, and there's no other way to do it. But all through economic history, there's been a lot of internal disagreement, fights about how to do things. And I think that's how it should be in a social science. But some of those ideas have gotten to rise so much to the top that even criticizing them within the profession are seen as like sacrilege or blasphemy. And I think that is not healthy for social science. So I think more internal disagreement on the fundamentals of how they work, and more openness to other disciplines. I think that would make them, and certainly all of us, much smarter about how the world really works.
As a continent, Europe traditionally sees itself as the home of well-functioning welfare states, or at least welfare states that maybe work a little bit better than elsewhere. Did you find from your research that the policies of governments across Europe are broadly better at recognizing the contribution that care work makes to the economy than countries elsewhere, or really not at all?
I think there's a historical perspective here for sure. So after the Second World War, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the way we looked at the economy was completely different than how we look today. So that was called the Keynesian period. And that was when a lot of the big welfare states all over Europe were built. And at that point, you saw something like hospitals or schools as an investment. So you said, okay, if we want smart people, healthy people, that is going to make us rich. And it has. It really has. I think many countries in Europe are still the envy of the world for a lot of feminist economists all over the world. They'll come to Denmark or Sweden or France and look at how we have childcare, how we do childcare, for example. But what happens at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, is that new economic ideas start to supplant the old Keynesian ideas. There are some big economic crises, and a new view of macroeconomics kind of comes to the fore and supplants the others. And that is a way of looking at the economy where the only thing that creates value is trading in the market. So when we buy and sell things from the private sector, that is where value comes from. And this completely changes the political landscape. And I think a lot of it has to do also with the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, because there comes this idea that it's the end of ideology, and now we just have to do smart economics and research-based policy. And that's a great idea. I agree with research-based policy. But what happens is that the science of economics and some ideas within the science of economics become cloaked as apolitical advice, when really they have actually quite a specific vision for what is good policy and what isn't. And that becomes very, very powerful. And I think right now, in all countries in Europe, we are seeing a polarization both on the left and on the right. So we're seeing an extreme frustration with the political system. And the way I see it is that both the anger on the left and the right comes from this sense that nothing ever changes. All the politicians are the same. I can't get anything to happen. They're just bureaucrats. And actually, when you look at how the political system works and how the economic ideals have been completely baked into politics, it is actually quite an astute observation that they are very similar. They're all working for the same thing. And I think when the democracy is not working, it creates frustration, and that's really dangerous. Radicalization on both fronts, both left and right, is dangerous because people stop trusting the system. And I think what I try to do with this book is to also reintroduce ideology, that you cannot ask an economist what is valuable. That is a democratic question that you must ask your citizens. What is a good life? That is what we vote on. And I think right now, citizens don't feel that they're voting on that. There aren't different visions of a good life. Everyone's doing the same thing. And I think that is really harmful. And I'm also trying to introduce that, we can have a different vision of a good life. And this book is made for people no matter where they are on the political spectrum. That if you think we should have more time for family, for rest, for nature, for each other, that is a viable option. We can do that. But we need to rethink how we organize politics if we do that.
Despite all of the frustrations that we've had growing in recent years, are there particular recent policy initiatives that have been introduced across Europe somewhere that you've come across while writing this book that made you think, oh, okay, this policy is something that is doing something concrete to better reflect the value that care work brings to society?
I think I'm going to give a little bit of an anti-intuitive answer, but bear with me. So right now, Germany is spending billions and billions of euros investing in weapons manufacturing and green energy. And
where is this going?
Yeah, I know. It's a winding road, but bear with me. And what is the big change in that, and what really is a big change in economics, is the idea that public investment is something that can create value and something that can strengthen the economy. And actually, in the EU fiscal compact, if you borrow money from the EU or from the IMF for a weapons industry, it is seen as an investment. But if you do it for schools or hospitals, it is seen as an expense. And I'm trying to be a glass half full girl here, right? And I'm hoping that this openness to the idea of public spending as something that contributes to the economy, something that creates value, is something that down the line also can start affecting other spheres of the economy, such as care, etc. In Denmark right now, we have such severe issues with youth mental well-being that we are also starting to see an economic worry that is manifesting in an interest in care, in saying, if every 10th of the youth are not showing up for school because they're so depressed and stressed, that's going to really impact them as a labor force. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what I say when I say that care is what makes all other work possible. And I think for a long time we've been thinking, it's expensive to invest in care, we don't have the money. But I think now we're starting to see it's also very expensive to not invest in care, to not have people feeling well, doing their best, feeling loved and respected and appreciated and feeling healthy. So I think we are starting to see the state play a new play a new role. I think China also plays a big role in this. They've been very, very skilled, for all their faults, in using the state for creating a very, very effective economy. And I think we're going to see the state play a much bigger role than they have been in the economy in Europe in the coming 20 years. But I hope they're not only going to be building guns and tanks, but also building healthy and happy people. And I think that that's what we're going to be fighting for now.
I didn't expect your optimistic answer to come from a huge, massive investment in weapons, but I understand your point.
I'm trying. I'm trying to keep my head above water in this geopolitical climate, and it is a struggle, I must say. But I'm trying.
We're all doing our best. I wanted to ask about one more specific example that I found really interesting in your book, which was this thing about national holidays and this like justification in euros that the Danish government gave when cancelling a national holiday in spring, effective in 2024. Like there were these huge economic claims about how much money the Danish economy would make by cancelling this holiday. But what were these political decision makers missing when they made that decision?
Yeah, so I think this is a very classic thing. I think this is going to start happening all over Europe. We're seeing it with pensions, with holidays, with specific, allowances. The politicians are coming out saying there's no money. We can save X amount of billions from doing this. And they did this in Denmark with Store Bededag, which was a one-day holiday that would usually fell on a Friday, so you got a long weekend. And now, a couple of years in, we're seeing that it did not at all generate all the extra work that was perceived to be done. It actually didn't even generate anything as far as they can see, just one day. However, what it has done is created huge social chaos, because this holiday was an extremely important holiday for doing, confirmations, which we do in Denmark when young people are Christian. When they are about 16, they'll confirm their faith, and they would have these big parties. They are now there's a day less to do that, where people are off. Huge social and sporting events were often on this day because people had the day off, and all of those things are now disappeared. And I think that for me is a perfect example of, we have a very concrete language for the cost of this day, right? That's the loss of work. We have the hours and we have the salaries, and that gives us a sense of very hard knowledge. But all of the, more abstract value of families coming together, of doing sports, having big sporting events, of, having these big markets in the spring, that value is completely invisible. And it was not even really that big a part of the debate that we were losing something. And I think this is what I see happening all over the political and social system, is that we do these calculations and it looks like, wow, we're going to be saving all this money. It's amazing. We're going to be so rich. But the social and human costs of what is being done is not registered anywhere. But we feel it in our bodies and minds, right? I think many people say we have gotten poorer, but I can't really put my finger on why. I don't feel better. And I think that was the sense of loss that I wanted to articulate with this book, that actually, if you feel that you feel poor in your soul in a way, you're not wrong. You're having a very concrete experience of something that is happening, but is not being registered or described anywhere.
We are coming towards the end of our conversation, Emma. So I wanted to invite you to dream a little. How could feminist economics change Europe? What would Europe look like if we did have feminist economic policies?
I think the first big thing would be shorter working time for everybody. I think for a long time, we've had this idea that we could get women to work exactly the same amount of hours as men. And that's been a big push. We're seeing it also in Germany now. And Matt's being out and saying we have all these lazy women not working. He doesn't want to build daycare centers to support this work, but that's another issue.
No, and they also want women to keep reproducing as well. Same, if not more children and more work. I think it's difficult for me to understand when economists are the most angry at women, when they have children or when they don't. But no matter what, they're doing something wrong. And I think lowering the working time and starting that project instantly, first in obviously the services sectors and the, white collar sectors, and then all over Europe, and going from, if not, 8 hours a day to 6 hours a day is an extremely important thing for equality in the home, for well-being in the home, for equality in the labor market. That would change so much, and I think also in local communities. So I think that would be the first thing that I would really hope. And I think we are actually seeing
big companies starting to do this now because they, big surprise, are seeing more well-being, more retention, and even some places increased productivity from this. So I think that would be the first thing. And I think I actually I get a lot of hope from people like Zoran Mamdani, Zach Polanski, who are really rallying people on politics that are about regular people's regular lives. I think sometimes and I think that's where the fascists in Europe have been much, much more skilled than the center parties and the left-wing parties at talking about everyday lives. What does your city look like? What does your children's school look like? What does your working life look like? And the center parties often have these big, abstract ideas of a good economy and growth and productivity. That doesn't mean nothing to anybody. Nobody understands what that means. Talk about, is the school good, yes or no? Are there trash on the streets, yes or no? Is your mother's care home good or bad? Like, those are the kinds of questions and the nitty-gritty questions we need to get into. And I think as soon as we start doing that, we will see a reignited interest in politics. And I think Zoran Mamdani is a perfect example of that. And he got a lot of votes from people who both identified as left-wing and right-wing. So I think a reignited interest in Europe in the everyday lives of people would make a big difference. And I think the distance between politicians and what we could call regular people has simply become too great. And when I've been so fortunate now, the book is out in a lot of European countries, and I get to travel and speak to people. And I think what's so amazing about talking about care work is that it is an issue that really unites across the political spectrum. Everyone cares about their children, their elderly parents, their brother who has a disability. It is something where we can really meet and speak about the conditions of everyday life. And I think it's a huge gift to be able to have that conversation. And I think the first politician in Europe who really understands how much care work matters to people is going to be very successful.